Welcome to the official YouTube channel of J.K. Jones, where listeners can enjoy romance audiobooks for free. Please like and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest releases. This audiobook is protected by copyright law. No part of it may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including recording or electronic methods, without the prior written consent of the author. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. To support ongoing content creation, consider joining the Patreon. Every contribution helps keep the stories alive.
Prologue. Timberwood Howls was where people vanished, and no one asked why. Jedidiah Barnet sat in the back of the bus, boots muddy, hands raw. Rain blurred the world outside. The words echoed in his mind. 24 hours. No second chances. Bring the Omega. Stephen Elijah, the town's gentle vet, an Omega with forest honey in his scent and kindness in his hands. Jedidiah had watched him once, smiling while wrapping a dog's leg like it was sacred. And now, he had to take him. Jedidiah had no money, no time. His sister was dying. This job, this abduction, was the only shot at saving her, even if it meant betraying the only person who'd ever made his wolf stir with something like hope. No matter how pretty Stephen looks, no matter how much the alpha in him wants, Jedidiah is out of time, and some choices can't be undone. Chapter 1. Jedidiah's hands trembled as he clutched the cards in his sweaty palms. Before him, a potent straight flush fanned out. The ace, king, queen, jack, and 10 of hearts, a winning hand in this high-stakes poker game. This was it. He'd been silently praying for luck, desperate for a miracle. His gaze remained fixed on the table, avoiding any distractions, feeling the tension in the room grow thicker than ever. It was akin to staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. He had to win this poker game. It was the only way he could save Isabella. After today, the doctor wouldn't come back, and the life-changing consequences scared him more than he could fathom. "Fold," a guy to his left said, and Jedidiah felt a little more hopeful. "Fold," muttered another guy. Now there was only one person left at the table with him. Kevin Whitmore. He looked fancy in his green suit, nothing like Jedidiah's old cowboy hat, all dirty and dusty. Jedidiah ran his thumb over his dry, cracked lips, ignoring the laughing women on his right. The casino thrummed with banjos playing and women chattering. His heart raced at the sharp eyes Kevin had trained upon him. Did he know Jedidiah had the winning hand? No, he couldn't possibly know. Jedidiah tried to keep his face neutral, but his heart wanted to flee his chest. This was it. Their way out. "It's time to show your cards," Kevin said with a smirk, and Jedidiah's heart dropped. He put his cards on the table slowly, and Kevin did the same. A straight flush. Jedidiah's mouth tugged into a grin, but it locked at a pained angle when he saw Kevin's hand laid out on the table. Impossible. Another straight flush, but not just any straight flush, the highest-ranking straight flush. The world dropped from below Jedidiah's feet. Kevin's cards formed a sequence from 10 to ace of spades, the highest-ranking straight flush possible. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the stunned players. Kevin's smirk stretched across his ugly face, and the other guys at the table laughed at Jedidiah. He could only watch as Kevin took all his money, and he was left with nothing but the treacherous feeling of failure. His stomach dropped like a stone. The rushing became louder in his ears, the casino's noise becoming dimmer. All he could feel was how much he'd messed up. As Kevin scooped up his chips with that triumphant smirk, Jedidiah's gut churned. Something didn't sit right as he replayed the hand in his head. He'd had the perfect cards, a royal flush, a surefire winner in any poker game. How had Kevin managed to beat him? It just didn't make sense. The highest-ranking flush was nearly impossible to get. The other players' laughter echoed in his ears, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have won this round. There was a nagging suspicion that something fishy was going on, a trick or a cheat he didn't catch. It was as if the cards themselves had conspired against him. He couldn't help but wonder if Kevin had an ace up his sleeve. Literally, I can't lose. I didn't lose. Something isn't right. Play again, Jedidiah insisted, stubbornly ignoring the sweat trickling down his brow, the tears blurring his vision. The thick haze in the casino surrounded him like an oppressive fog. He could feel his heart pounding, but he refused to let them see him defeated. Kevin leaned forward, those sharp green eyes of his still drilling into his. I've indulged you long enough, boy. You ain't got no more money to play with. Jedidiah swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. But it didn't matter. I have a few coins. Kevin interrupted with a sneer, his gaze drifting away as he signaled for his bodyguards to approach. No, please. We can go again. I ain't got much, but it's enough. Jedidiah, Kevin barked, cutting him off. I'm only helping you because your daddy was a good man. But since you've squandered all your family's fortune, there's no reason for you to be here anymore. Now get lost. Several burly men came forward to grab Jedidiah. Absalom fought for their ranch, but they lost it to the ruthless corporation known as Spurs and Company. They gobbled up all the land and left them with nothing. After their father's death, his sister, Isabella, fell gravely ill, and, unable to afford the medical bills, he'd turned to gambling to make ends meet. They knew that. They knew he wasn't here by choice or by personal conquest for victory, yet no one lifted a finger to help. A blistering red haze filled Jedidiah's vision, and before he could think, he latched onto Kevin's wrist, a guttural snarl erupting from his throat. The wolf inside him thrashed, and he was consumed by an overwhelming desire to tear him to shreds. But in an instant, strong hands grabbed his arm, pulling him away. He snarled and fought against the men so hard that he knocked over the table. His grip on Kevin's hand tightened, and he dug his blunt nails into the seams of his dress shirt, tearing it open. Cards went flying in all directions, and then it hit him like a thunderbolt. Kevin was cheating all along. Liar! Cheater! Jedidiah screamed, thrashing like a madman. But a swift boot to the gut knocked the wind out of him. Kevin's face turned a fiery red, his anger making his lip tremble. Get him out of here! Get him out! No. He started fighting with every ounce of strength he had left, but the men were too strong. They dragged him out and tossed him into the dirt, where agony ripped through him. They rained a barrage of kicks and punches on his face and stomach. The pain was excruciating, and he cried out as they stomped on his ribs and hands. The last thing Jedidiah saw before his vision faded to black were a pair of boots adorned with golden spurs. Lunarville, 1866. Jedidiah lifted his wide-brimmed hat with his thumb, squinting against the small, swirling tornadoes of dust and the sun's brightness. He chewed tobacco, spat, and the church bells rang out across the street, echoing through the dusty main street. The sun's heat turned his back into a wet canvas, beads of sweat carving a shimmering trail beneath his black, threadbare shirt. Come on, Jedidiah thought, gritting his teeth. He kept his hat low, his eyes trained on the ground. He had arrived in town 2 days ago, and he was itching to get on the road. Jedidiah leaned against the wooden railing near the stables, counting down the minutes until he could get the hell out of here. Hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it. He reached into his saddlebag for some oats and fed Nellie, his horse, patting her sleek mane and silently thanking her for coming all this way with him. He prayed she would make it back. God help him. He needs to make it back. A few people began filing out of the church dual doors, and Jedidiah straightened. He clicked his tongue at Nellie, unraveling her reins and getting her ready to bolt. Jedidiah was filthy. Covered in half a day's ride of dirt and grime, his hands were caked with more than mud. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. Desperation kept him moving, like a hook beneath his ribcage, tugging him forward. Jedidiah Barnet was a man of few luxuries, but the one luxury he planned to keep was his life. Then, finally, he came out. Stephen Elijah. The man parted the crowds like they were rivers and seas, with his sweet milk-honey scent and mere flutter of his long, dark lashes. Just shy of 19, he was an apprentice veterinarian down at the local ranch. His skin was pale as milk and finer than the smoothest porcelain. Stephen's sandy brown tresses were like the windswept shores, trailing down his firm back. His cravat was crisp and tied to perfection, along with his breeches that made his long legs appear endless. Jedidiah would give anything to get lost in his tight white heat. But he knew Stephen would never touch anyone covered in so much dirt. Jedidiah was filthy, in more ways than one. Jedidiah's fingers caressed the Colt python in its holster, tracing the contours of its sleek barrel as if deciphering a silent language of power. He could use it. He could point the 6-inch barrel at the Omega's temple and order him to do his bidding, but that would be too easy. Draw too much attention. Jedidiah would rather get in and out quickly without using such methods. Besides, should anything go wrong, Jedidiah would be forced to act. He spat again, his eyes narrowing as Stephen made his rounds to the churchgoers, shaking hands and making small talk. He moved with a careless type of grace, as if he were gliding on air, his movements like a crane taking flight. But Jedidiah didn't give a crap. Now he needed to move. Now. He pulled the black-stained scarf over his face, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time before he mounted his horse. He'd have one shot at this, and Jedidiah never missed. The hammering in his chest echoed like a distant storm. Jedidiah held the reins in a white-knuckled grip, watching, waiting. Stephen stepped further near the road, speaking to an elderly lady and matching her pace. Now Jedidiah shot out like a silver bullet, tearing down the road at a breakneck speed, and grabbed the Omega around his lithe waist, hoisting him over his horse. Stephen cried out, grappling in confusion, before Jedidiah blunted him over the head with a small wooden bat he kept in the saddlebags. He went limp like a doll. Shouts rang out, but Nellie was already galloping, her hooves thundering down the dirt road. "Hee-ya!" Jedidiah spat, and Nellie's powerful strides carved through the harsh terrain, evading their pursuit beneath her urgent and powerful strides. Jedidiah secured Stephen to the saddle using some rope, making sure the Omega didn't fall off. The last thing he wanted was for his captive to be trampled on the way to their destination. They had a long way to go, and he'd be damned if he lost his bounty before he cashed it. Exhilaration thrummed through his veins. Jedidiah kept off the main roads, trying not to stamp down the hope that surged in his chest. He'd deliver this Omega to that rat bastard Adonijah, and then he and his sister would be free. Jedidiah kept urging Nellie faster, ignoring her urgent whine, and barreled through the mountaintops of Lunarville. They'd reach Timberwood Howls in 24 hours if they were lucky. Jedidiah looked up, catching the lowering rays of the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. They were making excellent time. Luck, it seemed, was on their side. Not many people traveled this way to Timberwood Howls, mostly because not many people were utterly suicidal. The steep slopes and craggy peaks were enough to send anyone back to the main roads in fright. But Jedidiah knew this way, like the back of his hand. He'd traveled this road many times when transporting Isabella back and forth for medical treatment when they had their wagon. Jedidiah's heart tightened at the memory. Shadows deepened around the gullies and the rocks. They'd need to make camp soon, since it would be impossible to travel by nightfall. Jedidiah wasn't too keen on it, but Nellie's breathing grew laborious, her hooves slipping between the sinew and stones. It was best to stop now. Jedidiah found a secluded cave where he could tie Nellie up in case she got spooked during the night by wolves or coyotes. He lifted the Omega off Nellie's back. The man weighed nothing more than a feather, and lowered him onto a rolled-out saddlebag he'd unloaded first. Jedidiah made quick work of binding the Omega's hands and feet. He considered gagging him, but didn't think that would be necessary just yet. He got a fire started, making sure to feed Nellie the remainder of the oats he had left and some water. She drank greedily, and Jedidiah tracked the motion. His hunger pangs were sharp and insistent, like a chorus of demanding voices, each one clamoring for attention in the pit of his stomach. He ignored it. There was no time for that. Once his horse was fed, Jedidiah yawned and stretched his neck, craning to look behind him. The Omega was gone. What the hell? Jedidiah dropped his canteen, his eyes wild, until he saw the wench trying to climb through an opening in the cave. How the hell did he slip from Jedidiah's knots? Jedidiah snarled and grabbed the Omega by the shirt, hauling him back and throwing him onto the ground. The Omega bared his teeth, and Jedidiah knew he'd be screwed if he allowed the Omega to shift and run off. He leaped forward, grabbed Stephen by his wrists, and wrenched him over so hard that Stephen cried out. "Shut up and stay quiet," Jedidiah spat, unnerved by the slippery Omega. "Let me go, you bastard," Stephen screamed, scratching and clawing at Jedidiah's arm like a rabid beast. His mouth clamped down around his wrist, and then his teeth sank into his flesh. "You wench!" Jedidiah jerked back, and Stephen turned to run, but Jedidiah grabbed the back of his ponytail and yanked him back. Stephen wailed, flailing his arms wildly until Jedidiah locked him into a vice grip with his bicep curled around the Omega's throat. "Stop it! Yield to me, Omega!" "You bastard, let me go!" Stephen moved like the devil and threw an elbow back into his ribcage. Jedidiah grunted, absorbing the blow. He didn't want to hurt Stephen, not yet at least. He locked his bicep tighter, watching Stephen's eyes go wide as he gasped for breath. "Yield!" Jedidiah barked. "Screw you," Stephen said in a strangled whisper, and then his fist flew out, catching Jedidiah in the temple. Pain burst in his skull, but Jedidiah wasn't letting go. He growled, low and threatening, using his alpha scent to bully the Omega into submission. Jedidiah unleashed a wave of his alpha scent like a malevolent storm, twisting and suffocating the Omega's senses. It was grotesque and sour, stinging his nostrils, and Stephen whined, his Omega wolf in distress. Stephen gasped, his lashes fluttering as he struggled for breath. The alpha pheromones mixed with the bicep cutting off his air, forced Stephen to stop fighting. His body went lax in Jedidiah's arms. Damn it. Jedidiah's heart pounded like a hammer. He quickly grabbed the rope and with one hand bound Stephen's wrists. The Omega was deathly still, watching him. Up close, Stephen's eyes were like swirling pits of amber, thinned and narrowed into pinpricks. Jedidiah tried not to breathe too deeply, but it was impossible not to at the souring tint of the Omega's citrus scent. His cravat was torn, exposing his bare throat. Jedidiah tracked his rabbit-like pulse throbbing, saw the blood rushing to his face, and his pouty lips pulled into a sneer. He forced himself to look away. Using the rope, he tied Stephen to a rock near the fire and collapsed onto his bedroll, his chest heaving from the fight. Damn, did that Omega have a good right hook. He wheezed, laughed, and shook his head. Taking off his wide-brimmed hat, he ran a hand through his thick black hair, wincing at how it was caked with dirt and sweat. Nellie sat down nearby, but Jedidiah felt there was something wrong with her. Usually, after riding, she would graze for a bit, but this time, all she did was sit there, her expression forlorn. She ain't going to make it. The Omega spoke mildly, but his eyes were dark, sinister. Jedidiah realized he never looked away from him. Stephen Elijah wasn't a coward. He was a lot stronger than Jedidiah ever expected. Jedidiah closed his eyes, way too tired for this nonsense. "Shut up and go to sleep." "I'm thirsty." "Drink your spit." "And I'm hungry," Stephen said, his voice petulant. "Feed me." Jedidiah gritted his teeth, and rage sparked inside his core. "No!" Stephen smirked. "What will he say if you bring me back in such a bad condition? Now feed me, Alpha." Jedidiah cracked an eye open, staring back at the Omega. "He? You know who the hell I'm talking about. Now feed me. Or else I'll tell him what a horrible crap you were to me, and you won't get a freaking dime." Did he know who wanted to kidnap him? Obviously. No wonder he fought like the devil. Jedidiah's mouth kinked, and he reached into his saddlebag for some jerky, tossing it at the Omega's feet. Stephen's expression turned scornful. "How can I eat this without my hands?" "Nice try." "I'm serious. I'm hungry. Feed me." Jedidiah growled, picking up the jerky and forcing it between the Omega's lips and feeling satisfied when the wench choked on it. "There. Happy?" Stephen shot him a dirty look. "I need to use the bathroom." "Go in your pants." Jedidiah flopped back onto his roll, closing his eyes again. "And smell like piss the way you do. No thanks." Stephen sneered. "Look, you knothead ape. I need to piss, so are you going to help me or not? Or else..." Jedidiah barked a laugh. "Or else what? You'll threaten me? Save it. If you keep badgering me, I'll tie you outside for the coyotes to get at you. All he said was to bring you back alive. It's your choice how alive you'd like to be when you arrive." "You son of a..." Stephen cursed, and Jedidiah had never heard a gentle Omega swear so much in his entire life. Most of this amused him, but he was dead tired, and he didn't want to waste time fighting with the Omega when he needed to sleep. They both needed to sleep. Exhaustion nipped at his heels, and his eyes were nearly shut when an insistent rapping sound made them shoot open. Stephen was rubbing the rope against the rocks, trying to tear a hole in it. "God damn it!" Jedidiah swore, leapt from his roll, and grabbed Stephen around the base of his neck. As if he were waiting for the opportunity, Stephen spat the jerky he had eaten earlier into Jedidiah's face before headbutting him in the nose. The blunt force cracked his head against the cartilage, and agony tore through his skull. The blinding white pain in his temple flashed like a searing lightning bolt, momentarily drowning him in a wave of excruciating intensity. "Damn it!" Jedidiah roared, and Stephen jumped up, trying to flee. Jedidiah grabbed the rope and jerked it back, sending Stephen flying onto his back. Stephen scrambled to his feet, kicking out like mad with his wrists still bound. This was too much. Way too much. Jedidiah's mind warped. A guttural noise erupted from his chest, and Jedidiah grabbed Stephen's ankle, pulling forward so hard the fabric of his suit tore against the rocks on the dirt. Stephen cried out, flipping onto his stomach, trying to crawl away, but Jedidiah mounted him. Jedidiah was breathless with rage. It sprang to life, a fury so intense he wanted to strangle this Omega alive. 2 days. He'd been riding for 2 days non-stop. No food, no sleep. He was half mad with hunger. The wolf inside him snarled, smashing against the confines of his cage to be set free. He wanted to maim and kill this man. Jedidiah's hands turned into claws, and he dug them into the back of the Omega's neck and slammed Stephen's face into the dirt. "Yield to me," Jedidiah barked, his fangs cutting into his bottom lip. His eyes burned with fire. "Let go." Stephen flailed and bucked like a bronco, twisting and turning every which way and trying to throw him off. He cursed and fought, and Jedidiah could feel the bounty, along with his sister's life, slipping away from his grasp. Isabella was dying. Jedidiah only had a few hours to collect the bounty, head to the doctors, and get the medicine she desperately needed. He had gambled everything away for this. For his sister, the only family he had left. And this Omega bastard was going to ruin everything. Madness clawed at the edges of his sanity, a relentless force that fractured reason into jagged shards of irrationality. Jedidiah snarled, and then clamped his mouth down hard at the nape of Stephen's neck. Stephen choked on a scream, his back arched as Jedidiah's teeth pierced his flesh. It wasn't a mating bond. It was worse. Jedidiah's teeth sank deep, not enough to mark and claim, but enough to dominate. He'd force the wench to yield to him and be docile for the rest of the trip, and if Adonijah had a problem with it, then he could take it up with Jedidiah later. Stephen stilled, his body thrumming. Jedidiah didn't miss how Stephen's perky ass was pressed against his front. Firm, ample. That damn citrus scent filled his nostrils in tantalizing waves, causing delirium to drape over his consciousness, the disorienting fog distorting reality into a surreal tapestry of fleeting images and elusive thoughts. Stephen's breathing was calm and even, and for once, he didn't move. But Jedidiah could hear his panic almost as if the Omega was screaming at him. Jedidiah released Stephen and swiped away the blood pooling under his nose and trickling down his chin. The metallic taste flooded his mouth, making him want to gag. Freaking dog. "Get up," Jedidiah spat, hauling the Omega up and turning him around. Stephen's eyes were wet with unshed tears. He was shaking hard, and his lips were trembling. You bit me." "It's a subduing mark," Jedidiah snarled. "It'll heal in a day." Stephen shook his head manically. "You bit me. Against my will. You—" Jedidiah's throat constricted at the accusatory tone. There were laws against biting an unwilling Omega, and if he was found guilty, he'd find his way to the end of the gallows. But at this point, he didn't care. Nothing mattered besides having Isabella safe. "You'll pay for that," Stephen said, his eyes wide and frantic. "You've marked me. I'm tainted. You've destroyed my chastity. And I'll do a lot more than that if you don't shut the hell up," Jedidiah said, then reached into his bag for a cloth to wipe the blood. Most of it had stopped by now, thanks to his wolf healing abilities, but it had hurt like a mother lover. God, he was sick of this Omega. No wonder he was being kidnapped. They lapsed into silence, and Jedidiah cleaned the wound the best he could with what was left of his water. Nellie's head rested on her hooves, which were worn and cracked with jagged rocks protruding. Stephen was watching her too, frowning. "What have you done to her? You're such a beast. She needs rest. Look at her. She won't make it." Jedidiah tensed at the words. His lip rippled over his canines in a warning growl. Stephen scoffed. "Are you blind, or just plain stupid? Her legs are swollen. She can barely lift her head. She won't make it another mile. Take me back so that she can rest." Jedidiah didn't want to hear another word. He took out his filthy handkerchief and shoved it down the Omega's throat. Stephen sputtered for several moments, but didn't dare spit it out. Silence. Finally, Jedidiah tied the rope around his own wrist, effectively anchoring him to the rock while keeping the Omega as close as possible. If the rope moved, Jedidiah would sense it. Stephen watched him, his mocha eyes narrowed into slits. His wild, sandy brown hair was unbound, the tendrils framing his fair face. Jedidiah turned towards the fire, not wanting to look at him anymore. He knew exactly what the uppity Omega was thinking. They weren't going to make it. Jedidiah was going to fail. Nellie had a few hours left at most. The way her body sagged and her nuzzle dipped made Jedidiah's chest tighten. Nellie had been a gift from his father before he died. She had been with him since the beginning, before he'd been such a fool, gambling his life away. Nellie would leave him, along with Isabella, just like they all did. Jedidiah swallowed painfully around the dagger in his throat. He'd make it back to Timberwood Howls and save his sister, or die trying. Chapter 2. The fused warmth of dawn crept down the summit. When Jedidiah peeled his eyes open, they felt like they'd been welded shut and his mouth had been stuffed with sand. Crap. He dug his palms into his eyelids, ignoring the cold sweat breaking on his lower back. The nightmare hadn't helped things. Jedidiah's throat clicked as he swallowed, ignoring the flashing remnants of ghoulish eyes staring back at him in the dark. Isabella. Was she gone? He didn't want to think it. Jedidiah stood, kicking dirt over the ashes of the fire and beginning to pack up the camp. Stephen was fast asleep beside him, his body curled towards the rocks as if seeking warmth. This creature was unlike anything Jedidiah had ever seen before. The Omega was half feral, biting and clawing at him like some wild animal, and Jedidiah knew if he shifted, everything would be worse. Jedidiah scrubbed his beard, then ran a hand through his matted, thick black hair. He felt like he'd been run over by a carriage, and they still had a long way to go. He strode over to Nellie, feeding her the rest of the oaks and patting down her mane. It was no use. Her hooves were cracked and bloodied, her snout no longer damp, and her tongue hung out of her mouth listlessly. Jedidiah's chest tightened. Ignoring his own feelings, he got her to her feet. Nellie stumbled for a moment, but stood. They locked eyes. Her dark obsidian gaze reached like claws into the depths of his soul. The weight of panic pressed on him like an invisible boulder, a crushing force that left him gasping for breath. Jedidiah turned away. He couldn't think now. He couldn't feel. Emotions were too dangerous. He needed to act. Jedidiah hurried to pack up the camp, putting what he could on Nellie's back before heading over to wake up the sleeping Omega. Stephen's light snores grated on him, and Jedidiah shook the Omega hard. He jerked awake, his eyes wild as he turned to stare at Jedidiah. His mouth was still stuffed with the cloth from yesterday, and Jedidiah took it out of his mouth to give him a break. "What? Huh?" He spoke drowsily, his toffee-colored eyes blinking away sleep. Like a burst of sunlight, Stephen's Omega scent filled the cave with citrusy notes, a fragrance that infused the surroundings with a touch of zest. Jedidiah's stomach clenched, but he shoved it away for more pressing concerns. "Wake up. We're leavin'." "Leavin'?" Stephen asked, his expression incredulous. He turned to stare at Nellie, swaying lightly on her feet. "Are you crazy? She's about to collapse. Take me back to Lunarville so I can take a look at her." Jedidiah ignored him, strapping what he could to her flanks and then putting on her saddle. They have several miles of rugged terrain to get through, and if they were lucky, they'd reach Timberwood Howls. "Are you listening to me?" the brat snarled. "Untie me. She needs medical attention immediately, or else—" "Ah!" Jedidiah didn't let him finish, instead stuffing the cloth back into his mouth. He grabbed the Omega by the waist and hauled him over Nellie's neck. The Omega twisted and squirmed, bucking wildly like a bull. Jedidiah considered knocking him out again, but too much blunt force to the head could kill, and the last thing he needed was to arrive in Timberwood Howls with a dead bounty. Jedidiah sighed through his nose and climbed onto Nellie, forcing Stephen into an upright position nestled between Jedidiah's strong thighs. "Make another sound and I'll bite you again, this time for real," Jedidiah hissed into his ear. Stephen froze, his eyes wide. Those lashes stuttered prettily, and Jedidiah jerked Nellie's reins, leading her up the mountaintops. Jedidiah tracked his pulse, which beat like a fleeing rabbit down the long column of his bare neck. The Omega's fair skin was covered in a sheen of sweat and grit, his body perched on Jedidiah's lap, and pressing hard on him in a way that tested his self-control. Never mind all of that, Jedidiah thought, shoving those thoughts away. Jedidiah clicked his tongue, and Nellie began a slow canter down the mountainside. The sun beat down relentlessly, a fiery celestial hammer, scorching everything beneath its unyielding rays. Sweat dripped down his brow, and he wiped it away, trekking up the unforgiving slopes. Jedidiah should have relished the silence. Stephen didn't speak or try to take the cloth out of his mouth. He stayed silent. Eerily silent. Jedidiah's annoyance sparked. He knew the veterinarian was intelligent. He could see it behind those auburn eyes. Fiery and observant, Stephen's head swiveled to track every animal in sight. His keen ability to discern every movement hinted at a unique nature, an intense awareness of his own wolfish self. At first glance, the Omega seemed pensive and thoughtful, as if he were studying the saddle horn with remarkable precision, his fingertips tracing its patterned design. However, Jedidiah wasn't a fool. Intelligence emanated from him. Stephen was observing his surroundings, taking in the landmarks and memorizing their path. Jedidiah had taken this way many times before in the past and knew that most travelers would be accustomed to the main roads in Lunarville, certainly not the back ways through the treacherous inclines of jagged rocks and boulders. Nellie stumbled, and Jedidiah's heart leaped. No. They were on a steep incline, jagged slopes and rocks like cutting blades beneath them. If he could get her to sit. But before he could move, she tilted dangerously to the left. Stephen's eyes widened like saucers. "Hold on!" Jedidiah yelled, tightening the reins, but Nellie's ankles buckled, and then all three were falling. Jedidiah felt as if invisible hands compressed him downward, a relentless force like a plummeting rock. His lungs heaved, battling crushing pressure with each breath. His vision darkened, swirling, and he slammed against jagged rocks. Twigs and branches stabbed at his skin as he rolled, holding onto the Omega for dear life. They plunged into a hedge, Jedidiah crying out as his back struck a bulging root. Stephen's elbow knocked the breath from his lungs, and he was screaming around the cloth stuffed into his mouth. Jedidiah looked up to see Nellie hurtling toward them at breakneck speed. Grunting, he used his power to jump from the hedge, but with the Omega in his arms he lost height, and he landed with an audible snap. Pain shot through his ankle as they crashed against the dirt road. Jedidiah's vision swam, bursting into a kaleidoscope of colors, fading in and out. The metallic taste of blood flooded his mouth, nearly making him gag. Jedidiah lay on the dirt road, his senses engulfed in a disorienting delirium. The world spun in a dizzying dance of colors and shadows, and the metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth. Sounds became distorted echoes, distant and muffled, as if he were underwater. He tried to focus on Nellie and Stephen, but their figures blurred into indistinct shapes. The air felt heavy, pressing down on him, and he struggled to draw in breaths. The pain in his ankle radiated through his body, a throbbing pulse that matched the disarray in his mind. Through the haze, Jedidiah glimpsed the outline of Nellie, the 1,000-pound horse now still, but his mind couldn't make sense of the scene. Nellie. The world tilted and swayed, eluding his attempts to grasp it. His attempts to speak yielded only garbled whispers lost in the dissonance of his surroundings. Jedidiah clung to consciousness, grappling with the surreal melding of pain, colors, and fractured sounds. Then Stephen's face filled his vision. There was a cut above his brow. His mouth was moving frantically until finally the sound burst through Jedidiah's eardrum like a strange animal shrill. "Hey! Hey, don't close your eyes! Keep your eyes open!" Stephen screamed, hauling him into a sitting positing against a boulder. He worked off his shoe, taking a look at his ankle that appeared 3 times its size. "Nellie," Jedidiah said, but it was garbled nonsense. "I told you she wouldn't make it, you stubborn fool," Stephen hissed, and he sighed as he stared at the ankle. It was screwed. Jedidiah didn't need a doctor to tell him that. With his wolf abilities, it would heal in a few days, but Jedidiah was malnourished, starving, exhausted from traveling non-stop for 2 days straight. "Wow, we have to make it back." "Have to." Jedidiah slurred, trying to get up, but Stephen forced him back down. "What's your name?" Stephen asked, ripping off pieces of his now filthy white shirt and tied them around his ankle. Jedidiah Barnet." "Jedidiah, here's what's going to happen. You're going to shut up and I'm going to find a shelter. Got it? We're way off track now. We were supposed to pass through the mountainside until we got to the Timberwood Howls side roads. This road, I've never seen it before. I don't know where we are." "Never seen it before." "Wait. What?" Jedidiah could barely process the stream of words passing through Stephen's lips. Did the Omega know this way? Jedidiah took in a sharp breath. So, this whole time, this Omega knew exactly where they were going. He thought he'd been clever taking this way, but it turned out he wasn't. Freaking hell. Jedidiah wiped his brow with a shaky hand, then glanced at the side and saw Nellie's still form. Her legs were twisted, her body a mangled mess. Jedidiah felt like he'd been struck over the head. "No!" Jedidiah crawled toward her, ignoring Stephen's pleas. A sob tore through his throat, a raw and visceral expression of grief for Nellie, his beloved horse. She wasn't just a companion. She carried the weight of memories, a connection to a father now gone. His father had gifted Nellie to him before his untimely death. "I'm sorry," he whispered, bitter tears falling from his eyes. It was all his freaking fault. He ran his fingers through her thick hair, his stomach clenching in agony. He should have listened, but Isabella needed them. He had to get back. There was no time. Jedidiah pressed his face to her firm neck, feeling like his chest had been cracked open with a mallet. Stephen was beside him in seconds, guiding him back. "Jedidiah, listen to me. We need to find shelter. Please, try to relax," he coaxed, but Jedidiah refused to let go. He couldn't let go. They had come so far, and Jedidiah knew he was going to fail. Stephen saw it too. The desperation in his eyes the moment they met. It was a gamble, and Jedidiah had lost. His breath came out in steaming pants, his vision blurred like he was submerged in a tub of hot water, and he let those dark hands drag him under. Jedidiah awoke to shadows dancing on the cave walls and ghoulish red eyes peering from the abyss. He blinked several times, and then they were gone. The crackling fire spat sparks, and the scent of charred flesh lingered. Stephen hunched over the flames, roasting cottontails while crushing herbs with 2 stones. Attempting to sit up, Jedidiah was blinded by pain and choked on a scream. He gripped his thigh, only to discover his ankle immobilized with a stick. The useless joint was throbbing and the size of a plum. The sight of it stole his breath. "Don't move," Stephen cautioned, unwrapping bandages to reveal a large gash on Jedidiah's shoulder where a stick had punctured his skin. Stephen rubbed some herbal salve over the bruised skin and then wrapped it again. He went back to the fire to make some more. Jedidiah watched the scene completely perplexed. Who saves their kidnapper? This Omega was certainly strange. The scent of roasted cottontails filled Jedidiah's nostrils as he watched Stephen sprinkle herbs to enhance the aroma. Jedidiah's stomach clenched, hunger a relentless monster clawing at his chest. A few minutes later, Stephen returned with fresh water, bringing it to Jedidiah's lips. He drank greedily, his throat raw and aching. "There's a stream nearby," Stephen answered his unspoken question. "You know this area." Jedidiah couldn't hide the shock in his voice. Stephen shot him a dirty look. Do you think this is the first time my uncle tried to kidnap me?" Jedidiah felt like he'd been doused with cold water. "Uncle?" The man who approached him claimed Stephen was his mate, not his nephew. A wave of disgust swept over Jedidiah, but then again, he wasn't surprised. Adonijah was one of the richest men in Timberwood Howls. He owned the saloon on 15th Street, and Jedidiah owed him a lot of freaking money. The deal was, he would kidnap his wayward mate, and, in return, he would absolve the debt and help Jedidiah get the money to save his sister. "So, what did he promise you?" Stephen asked, unraveling another bandage on Jedidiah's broad chest and applying more medicinal salve. "Money? Women?" Stephen snorted. "Figures. You knothead alphas are all the same." "You reckon you know me," Jedidiah said with a cough. "I know enough, Alpha," Stephen replied, his mouth thinned. "I've been this way half a dozen times. I probably know it better than you, and now—" Stephen pressed a finger to his ankle, causing Jedidiah to shout in agony, "You're at my mercy!" Jedidiah glared at the Omega, who only laughed. "It doesn't matter. We're going back to Lunarville. You caught me off guard, but it won't happen again," Stephen said, then sealed the wound back up. "That's what you think." But Jedidiah didn't bother replying. Stephen went over to the fire, picking up a cottontail and blowing on it. Jedidiah was starving. He was so hungry, he thought his stomach would crawl through his mouth. Damn it. Stephen took a bite of the roasted flesh and moaned, his eyes slipping closed and his long lashes fanning over his pale cheeks. "Delicious," he said, nibbling on the food. Jedidiah licked his dry, cracked lips, watching the Omega eat his fill and unable to do anything about it. Stephen finished the cottontail at record speed and then brought Jedidiah his food, carrying it over in a large leaf. "Don't eat too fast. I think you have a concussion." He handed the food over, and Jedidiah snatched it, biting into the cottontail and devouring it with gusto. A burst of flavor flooded his mouth. The skin was crisp and juicy, while the blend of herbs made it taste extraordinarily wonderful. Jedidiah ate fast, devouring the food in several large bites. But Stephen was right, because the second he was finished, his stomach roiled, threatening to bring it all back up again. Jedidiah swallowed down the taste of bile and forced himself to take several deep breaths. "Here, I reckon you'll need this," Stephen said, passing him some water. Jedidiah drank most of it and slumped against the boulder. Exhaustion chipped away at his resolve, and his eyes fluttered closed. "Where are we?" he demanded, just to keep himself awake. The Omega could bolt at any moment, and Jedidiah knew then he'd be at square one. Nellie's loss would mean nothing, nor would all the time he spent subduing the Omega. No, Jedidiah had to fight, regain his strength. Who cared if Adonijah was Stephen's uncle? It was sick, yes, but stranger things had happened. Jedidiah would force himself to turn a blind eye to it all. "Back at the cave," Stephen replied. "I'm taking you back to Lunarville." The memory of those words flittered into his mind, and Jedidiah realized Stephen had dragged him back up the mountainside and into the cave, finding the path they had taken earlier. Damn it. They were going back the way they came. That wasn't good news. A soft rustling noise caught his attention, and his blood ran cold. Jedidiah's hand shot out, and he grabbed the Omega's thin wrist and yanked him to his chest. Stephen cried out, tumbling down onto Jedidiah. "What the hell are you doing?" Jedidiah's eyes shot open. "Shut up," he hissed. "Listen." Stephen stared up at him, his pink lips parted. "It's just the wind." Jedidiah shook his head. An unfamiliar stench filled his nostrils, and the sound of boots crunching against the dirt made the hairs on his arms bristle. They weren't alone. The only people who resided so high up in the mountaintops were bandits, one of the reasons why Jedidiah wanted to rush to the safety of Timberwood Howls before it got too late. Stephen's eyes landed on his pistol. The Colt python sat in his holster, glittering in the firelight. Before Jedidiah could stop him, Stephen ripped it out and scrambled back, his face flushed. Jedidiah tried to grab for him, but the Omega moved like the devil, scurrying out of reach and holding the gun in his hand. Damn it. Jedidiah gritted his teeth, and then his eyes darted toward the cave entrance. They should retreat further inside and douse the fire so that they couldn't be seen, not face the attackers head-on. Jedidiah was injured, and Stephen probably couldn't fight them off. They might be villagers. Stephen spoke low, his face looking oddly hopeful. I can tell them what happened. They'll help me get back. Jedidiah shook his head. No, they're... Wait here, Stephen said, shoving the gun into the waistband on his jeans near his lower back. Jedidiah wanted to shout at him, but it was too late. He was already rounding the corner to greet the newcomers. Damn it. For an Omega who seemed so smart, he was really freaking stupid. A scream pierced the air, and Jedidiah's heart lurched. He clawed at the rocks and forced himself to stand on his bad leg, fumbling for the butcher's knife that rested on his thigh. Put the knife on the ground, Alpha, and your little Omega won't be harmed, a voice called. Two men bled from the shadows, their faces covered in rot and filth. A man built like a brick house dragged Stephen into the cave by his neck, pressing his face against the Omega's temple, inhaling deeply. A mighty fine haul, if I do say so myself, the man chuckled, exposing blackened teeth. Isn't that right, Jedidiah? Chapter 3. Layman. Damn it. Jedidiah didn't move. He kept his gaze trained on the bastards as they inched deeper into the cave. The man's large hand was clasped around Stephen's throat, thumb pressed against his fluttering pulse. Layman inhaled deeply, palming himself, not even bothering to hide his fierce desire for the Omega. The other man inched closer, ready to strike if Jedidiah made any sudden moves. This crap just went from bad to worse. So, this is where you've been holding up, Layman whispered, licking Stephen's cheek. All cozy with Yah up in the mountains here. He chuckled. Don't worry. This is more than enough in terms of payback, Jedidiah. I reckon you've been expecting me too. Some, Jedidiah replied. I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to follow me, though, especially when you knew I was on an errand for Jedidiah. Layman barked a laugh. I'm sick of that uppity bastard. Besides, everyone from here to Timbuktu knows how obsessed that bastard is with his goddamn nephew. The man's barking at a knot, if you asked my opinion. But that doesn't matter. What matters is, his obsidian eyes turned to glare at Jedidiah. You owe me my freaking money. And you think I have it? Here in a freaking cave with my ankle folded into a pretzel. Jedidiah spat. I think you have something of worth, Jedidiah. Layman leered. Something invaluable on you that you wouldn't trade for nothing, and I want it. And this pretty Omega here too. Jedidiah's entire body went cold. He'd felt like he'd broken through the first layer of thin ice on a lake and was submerged in its icy depth. His father's pocket watch, the last thing he had from him, and the one thing Jedidiah refused to sell, no matter how much his debts piled up. Layman's hands trailed across Stephen's skin, blackening it with his touch. Both men were covered in filth, their gazes beady in the firelight. A bitterness swelled inside his throat, but Jedidiah swallowed it down. I don't have it, and you can take the Omega. He bites too much anyway. Layman chuckled. Oh? And you don't mind returning Adonijah's Omega-tainted? Jedidiah shrugged, turning his face away. You're a bold one, Jedidiah, Layman said, but my patience is running thin. No matter. We'll have our fun here. I guess you aren't curious about that little birdie of a sister you got back in Timberwood Howls." Jedidiah clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Oh, that Isabella was a mighty fine bird. Stupid, but mighty fine, I'll say. Too bad she didn't want to tell me where you were when we went there first. Layman chuckled, slowly unbuttoning Stephen's shirt. Too bad the Omega had to fight. Too bad. Jedidiah's heart lurched, his fury springing to life like a leopard from the wheat fields. "What the hell did you do to her?" he snarled, teeth bared. Layman didn't look at him. His eyes were drawn to Stephen's chalky skin. "What do all alphas do? They take their fill." He smacked Stephen across the face, and he spun, his knees buckling until he ended up on the hard ground. The Omega didn't make a sound, but his scent spiked. The rancid smell invaded Jedidiah's nostrils, sharp and tangy like spoiled milk. They take their fill. Jedidiah's felt the hairs on his arms bristle. Isabella was deathly ill. There'd be no way she could fight back, and knowing Layman, he would toy with her mercilessly. The only person who would know Jedidiah was on a mission to bring Adonijah's nephew back would be the man himself, and the bastard was the type to disclose that information, for a small fee, of course. Layman was freaking vermin. A grisly man whom Jedidiah had gambled against to pay off his sister's medical bills. She didn't tell him anything, which meant Adonijah did. He set Jedidiah up to freaking fail so that he wouldn't have to pay him the bounty owed. Stephen seemed to lock up. He appeared almost frozen as Layman forced him onto his stomach, face first into the dirt, his body trembling. His rage erupted like a sudden explosion, a forceful and uncontrollable burst of anger that shattered the calm like a detonating bomb. A searing heat coursed through Jedidiah's veins like liquid fire, intensifying until it reached a boiling point. However, just as he was about to shift, he cried out in agony. He stared down at his throbbing ankle, realizing that it was swollen to the point of a large grapefruit. If he shifted now, he could shatter his legs since the bones and tendons needed to stretch and shift into his wolf form. Damn it. Layman pressed Stephen's face into the dirt, fumbling with his belt buckle, his eyes wide and rabid. They scream, every single one of them, even your sister. Layman laughed, grabbing a fist full of Stephen's hair. She cried out for you. Ain't that a kicker? And her daddy Absalom. Jedidiah saw red. He scrambled to his feet, hopping on his one good leg. He'd kill the bastard. He'd freaking kill him. But before he could take one step, a man the size of a boulder barreled into him. They both hit the ground hard. The man used his bulk to press Jedidiah into the ground, forcing an arm around his neck and suffocating him. Jedidiah's eyes went wide, and his hand shot out to punch the guy, but he was way too big. He snarled, grappling with the guy and flipping him over onto the hard stone. Stephen screamed, and ice filled his veins. Jedidiah scrambled to get up, only to have his knees knocked out from behind him. The ground rushed up to meet him, and he went down hard, absorbing the force with a muted thud. The man crawled on top of him, pinning him down. The stench of rot filled Jedidiah's nostrils, making him want to gag. No, he had to fight. In a cloud of swirling dust, Jedidiah engaged in a fierce brawl with the larger opponent. Punches and kicks were exchanged amidst the chaos. A sharp blow to his face blackened Jedidiah's vision, the edges darkening as dizziness clouded his consciousness. The man seized a rock, smashing it against Jedidiah's head. A wave of dizziness swept over him, and he twirled uncontrollably, crashing into the hard rocks of the cave. The rocks crumbled around him. Jedidiah couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Pain pulsated with every breath. All he could do was lie there, the world spinning out of his orbit, while these men took what they wanted. Isabella's face flashed before his eyes. She had been the only one left in his life, but Jedidiah knew now that she was gone, dead, and Layman had killed her. Fury erupted inside him, and Jedidiah attacked. Seizing the man's neck, Jedidiah drove his fist into the man's throat and delivered a devastating blow to the solar plexus. The man crumpled like a felled oak tree, his body hitting the ground with a resounding thud. Stephen's screams pierced the air, and Jedidiah barely had a moment to breathe before he was scrambling over to them. The Omega bucked and kicked like a wild bronco, and Layman cursed, trying to subdue the near-feral bobcat. "Omega wench!" Layman spat. His fist shot out, clipping Stephen in the jawline, and the Omega's head snapped back, blood erupting from his mouth. Jedidiah jumped on Layman's back, hauling him up, not giving a damn about his shattered ankle. He grabbed his butcher's knife and angled it, pointing the tip into Layman's throat. "Where is she? Where's Isabella? Ugh!" Layman had elbowed him in the stomach and then rounded on him, kicking Jedidiah's kneecaps. Jedidiah gasped as sharp pain stabbed at his leg, and he went down like a sack of rice. Mind-numbing pain gripped him, a relentless agony that blurred his vision into a swirling abyss. No, but his leg was screwed. He had been utterly immobilized by the blow. It shot through his neck cap like a fierce dagger. Stephen was able to scurry away, inching to the mouth of the cave. His clothes were torn off his body. How far did Layman get? How slow had Jedidiah been moving? He saw his answer by looking back at Layman as he advanced toward Jedidiah. Bile rose like the swell of a tide in his throat, and he could do nothing but wheeze frantically, trying to breathe through his panic and pain. Layman chuckled, kneeling down beside him. He fisted Jedidiah's long black hair, jerking his head upward. "I done told you," Layman sneered. "I screwed that wench and tossed her useless body into the ditch. I reckon you know the spot, where the dogs and the coyotes come for the dead. It's where all Barnets go in this county. You'll do well to remember that." Jedidiah's throat constricted. Unimaginable agony curled through him, and he fought down the sob that threatened to erupt. Dead. She was dead. He'd felt it somewhere along the lines. Isabella Barnet was no more, just like the rest of his family. The click of a gun sounded, and Jedidiah's head snapped up. Stephen's eyes were blazing, his face white as a sheet as he held Jedidiah's clot python in a trembling grip. Layman stood slowly, a greasy smile curling his lips. "What you got there, little one?" Stephen's tawny eyes were glittering with hostility, and he was shaking so badly he couldn't even aim properly. Damn it! If Layman got a hold of that gun, they'd both be done for. Layman took a step forward, but Stephen didn't move. "Now, don't go getting your panties in a bunch, Omega. I was just having a little fun is all, just like your uncle and his little parties back in the day. Remember? It ain't nothing but a good time. Now that I'm looking at you, I remember you clearly. You were Adonijah's favorite, especially with all that money your mother seemed to keep locked up. The witch never liked to share." He moved with lethal grace, immobilizing Stephen with his sick and twisted words. "But she didn't mind sharing you." "Give me the gun," Jedidiah barked at Stephen. "Throw it here." "Yeah," Layman drawled. "She shared you all right. Adonijah got you that fancy veterinarian degree, but when it was time to pay up, you decided not to come back." Damn, the bastard was too close. Stephen's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, his eyes wide as if all the revolting things Layman was talking about were happening right in front of him. Sweat pooled on Stephen's forehead. He was sucking in hard peals of breath, and a sweet citrus scent filled the air. Oh no, stress heat. Damn it. "Stephen," Jedidiah yelled at him, "give me the freaking gun." Damn, you smell good. Ripe. Layman chuckled, his nostrils flaring. Well, don't worry, little one. You ain't as chaste as you want the nice people of Lunarville to believe. Imagine if they knew Stephen Elijah took 5 to 10 fat alphas a night, that the Omega wench screamed for it. Layman was within reach now. It wouldn't take much for his hand to dart out and clamp around Stephen's throat. Stephen pressed the gun to his sternum, and Layman's grin grew. Don't worry, Adonijah will come for you. One way or another, you're family after all, ain't ya? When Stephen spoke, his voice was as empty of life as a crypt. Go to hell. The gunshot echoed through the air, a sharp crack splitting the silence. Layman's body jolted, and then he stared down at the massive smoking hole through his chest. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled from his throat, spilling down his shirt as he fell to the ground. Jedidiah pushed himself to his knees, his heart hammering in his ears. Stephen was still standing there, his face pale as a ghost, while he held out the smoking gun, the smoke ringlets curling around the nozzle before dissipating in the air. Jedidiah crawled over to him and calmly placed his hand on Stephen's. The Omega whirled on his, fangs bared. It's okay, I won't hurt you, Jedidiah said. It's over. Stephen's eyes filled with tears, and he allowed Jedidiah to take the gun from him. Jedidiah engulfed the Omega into his strong arms, hoping like hell he could shove away all the nasty things Layman had said, but knowing he couldn't. It was probably all true. Jedidiah's heart ached for the Omega, and for a moment he stayed there, holding him, not expecting anything in return. Then 2 small arms came around his waist, and the Omega's face was buried in his large pecs. Stephen took large gulps of air, his body quivering. He's a monster. They're all freaking monsters. I know. All too well, he knew. They couldn't stay there. Coyotes howled in the distance, and Jedidiah knew they'd be drawn by the scent of blood wafting from his ankle. They packed what they could, stealing the weapons and horses from the dead men before heading back out into the wilderness. It was a moonless night. They trudged along the rocky terrain, and Stephen made sure to hold the reins of the horses tightly. Jedidiah sat atop one of the beasts, keeping as much pressure off his leg as he could. They chanced upon a tranquil oasis on the mountainside, where water draped over the rocks in a silvery sheen, reflecting the stars above. Jedidiah sat near the water. Every movement had been agony, but somehow he'd managed to make it. Stephen got a fire going, and he worked in silence for a long time before sitting down beside him. Here, let me look at it, Stephen said, gesturing to his swollen ankle. Jedidiah winced as Stephen peeled off his boot. It was now the size of a tender plum, pink and throbbing with each breath. Stephen elevated it on some rocks, gently probing the skin. It's a clean break. If you stay off it, I reckon it'll heal in a few days. Jedidiah pursed his lips and said nothing, staring off into the distance. In the night air, Stephen's citrus scent wafted, a vibrant blend of oranges and grapefruits, slicing through the darkness like a fragrant knife. However, it was twinged with rot, a frantic undertone that had Jedidiah on edge. Stephen would go into a stress heat. It was the natural defense Omegas had against unwanted alphas, their biology forcing them into a fight-or-flight mode. They both knew it wouldn't be long until Stephen was writhing on the shorebanks, bucking his hips and begging to be filled. It seemed like the inevitable foregone conclusion between them, and he wouldn't lie and say he'd never felt it. Since the day he had laid eyes on the Spitfire Omega, he knew their fates were tied together. I recognized him, Stephen said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. That rat bastard, Adonijah, my uncle. I freaking knew he'd send someone for me. Stephen's jaw was clenched. That's why I froze. I froze like I was nailed to the freaking counter. I was so weak. Always so freaking weak. Stephen's sharp scent snarled in Jedidiah's nostrils, filling his throat with the warmness of orange and lemon zest. It intoxicated him, and yet his stomach knotted at the pain this Omega must have suffered at the hands of his uncle. "You ain't weak, Stephen." When Jedidiah spoke, his voice was gravelly. "You stared down the length of a bull and didn't flinch. That ain't weakness. That's strength." Stephen pressed his lips together. "I froze. You fought him. You got him off me before." His breath hitched. "You saved me." "We saved each other, Omega," Jedidiah responded. "Don't go giving me credit for crap I didn't do." Stephen laughed wetly. "I feel like a dog thanking his master for scraps. I reckon now you know everything you won't care about taking me against my will." Jedidiah picked up a rock and tossed it into the water. It plopped, sending ripples down the lake before it sank to the bottom. He'd never laid with an Omega before. Jedidiah wasn't the type to sleep around. His father had always taught him that they were meant to be cherished, that each Omega was a precious pearl. Besides, nobody looked twice at him. Jedidiah had no money. For many years, all he could do was gamble to help pay for his sister's debts. But now all that was gone. She was gone. He knew in his heart that she was. Jedidiah wanted to drown himself in the lake. Tilting his head back, he stared up at the sky. The stars were scattered across inky blankness like spilled powder, and he wished he could become one with the heavens. A small hand touched his cheek and came away wet. Jedidiah turned to stare at Stephen, who had touched him. "I'm sorry for your loss, Alpha." He refused to grieve. He'd fight, survive. "You don't have to stay here, Omega. You can leave. I won't stop ya. You can live." Stephen shook his head. "I can't. He'd just find me again anyway. I'm better off facing him again for the last time." Jedidiah didn't like the sound of that, but it wasn't his place to talk. There was nothing waiting for him in Timberwood Howls except death. Stephen's face was bitter and pale, his caramel eyes glistening with tears. "I ain't never been with an Omega, especially one as fine as you," Jedidiah said, feeling heat crawl over his face. "I won't hurt you, I promise. I won't." Stephen's mouth kinked ruefully. "I know you won't." They were in a tough situation. Being caught in a stress heat could very well kill them both. Wolves would be drawn to the stench, and Jedidiah wouldn't be able to properly defend Stephen if more men started coming. And from what he knew of Layman, the bastard never traveled alone. There would be more, and soon. The only thing that would stop a stress heat would be a forced copulation. As a vet, Stephen would know that. Stephen swatted at his tears and abruptly stood, peeling off his clothes one by one. Jedidiah watched, his mouth dry and his eyes like saucers. As Stephen walked into the water, the clouds parted and the moonlight shone upon him, causing his alabaster skin to glisten in the light. Stephen took the band from his hair, and Jedidiah watched it spill down the length of his back. Turning his face over his shoulder, Stephen smiled, but it was sad, resigned. Jedidiah could taste his scent now, could feel it thicken like cotton in the back of his throat. Then he was moving, taking off his sweat-slicked clothes and wading into the lake's still waters. The second it kissed his flesh, he shivered and his entire body heated with desire. Stephen's back was to him, arms wrapped around his shoulders as if he were holding himself together. A pearl. Jedidiah's breath caught, and he didn't hesitate bringing the Omega into his arms. He vowed in his heart to protect him. For once in his life, do the right thing. Stephen had come into the water, wading in its icy depth with every intention to give himself to Jedidiah. And Jedidiah could do nothing but succumb to it. Chapter 4. It wasn't like he imagined it to be. Jedidiah wasn't a fool. Sure, he'd never lain with an Omega before, but he'd seen enough of them to know the mechanics of things. Many times, Jedidiah had seen alphas in a rut, feral and rabid, taking Omegas while they wailed for help. The worst thing he'd seen was alphas past the point of no return, beating Omegas into a bloody pulp and then freaking their corpses between the dark alleyways of the night. Some were punished, of course, while others remained to roam free and were even commissioned if they knew the right people. The rules were enforced, and most deputies could track the alpha by the stench he left behind on the Omega. Jedidiah's stomach coiled in disgust, the wounds on his body throbbed, and it hurt to breathe, but he found himself deep breaths, filling his lungs with Stephen's scent. They stood in silence, waist deep in the still waters. Jedidiah was too nervous to move, even though his ankle was beginning to ache. Stephen turned to him, and tears streaked down his cheeks. "I won't trust you, Alpha. As you should know, I trust no one." Jedidiah couldn't imagine growing up the way he did, doing the things he had to do. Adonijah was a powerful man, and he shuddered to think about crossing him. He reached down, brushing his calloused thumb across the Omega's wet cheek. "Don't trust me. I can't save you. I have nothing to offer and nothing to give. Except this." Stephen's lashes fluttered, his toffee cream eyes disappearing for a moment. "I'm ready. Take me." Jedidiah shuddered at those words. He wouldn't be rough. This Omega had had enough of that. He'd make it good. Or try to. Jedidiah pressed his lips to Stephen's shoulder, reveling in his shiver. He scraped his beard across the Omega's skin, his tongue darting out to lick and taste the pale flesh. Stephen's throat bobbed. He tilted his head back as if restraining himself against something. This was his first time. Jedidiah would relish every touch. He grazed the Omega's narrow waist, rubbing his fingers over his jutted hip bone. Stephen was taller than most Omegas, lithe and angular, almost like a crane. His legs seemed smooth and endless. He'd make it good, for both of them. Jedidiah woke to the gentle caress of sunlight, its fingers dancing over his brow like playful whispers. Pebbles stuck to his skin, and he rolled onto his side with a groan. Pain pulsed around the edges before becoming more and more insistent, like a beating drum. Jedidiah hissed and touched his leg. His ankle was worse than yesterday and looked to be the size of an eggplant. "Damn," he whispered and tried to sit up. The enticing smell of roasted nuts and oats wafted through the air, and Jedidiah caught sight of Stephen tending to a small campfire. The sun was just cresting the hilltops of the horizon, soaking their oasis in warmth. Stephen was dressed in his clothes from yesterday, and Jedidiah noticed his drying on the rocks nearby. He got ready, hobbling over to Stephen with one boot on. "Mornin'," he drawled, and felt his face burn, remembering what they did the day before. "Mornin'," Stephen said, and passed Jedidiah a bowl of food. "Here, eat this." Jedidiah took in the enticing aroma of the nuts and oats and ate in silence. He wondered where Stephen got the food from, but then realized they had raided Layman and he must have kept it all on the horses. Good. It would take another few hours to head back into Timberwood Howls, and that would be if nothing stopped them. Yeah, right. With his track recorded, they would be lucky to make it out of the mountaintops alive. "I reckon we have a few hours of ridin'," Stephen said, squinting against the light. "That's if your ankle can take it." Jedidiah swallowed hard and suddenly didn't feel like eating. "You don't have to go back, you know. You can stay in Lunarville. I won't say nothing, and you can live your life." Stephen's smile didn't reach his eyes. I can't do that. I'm his creature, you see, and all creatures return to their masters. Besides that, you need to get paid. I'll see to it. Once he has me disappear, don't look back. I'll manage, just like I always do." Jedidiah hated the sound of that. There was no way he'd leave this Omega in the claws of Adonijah, not after last night. He knew he was getting attached way too quickly. They barely knew each other. Stephen could have a mate in Lunarville or someone he really liked. All Jedidiah would do is make a fool of himself, but he couldn't help it. Stephen tucked a stray sandy brown tendril from his brow, and his eyes were bright hazel, like the color of fallen leaves. Jedidiah's throat dry clicked. He was more than beautiful. Stephen was freaking ethereal. No wonder Adonijah wanted to possess someone like him. "How about this?" Jedidiah said, clearing his throat. "We do something even better." Stephen tilted his head, intrigued. "If what Layman said was true, and all he wants is your mother's inheritance, then we give it to him on one condition. The inheritance must prioritize the Omega's maternal lineage." Stephen kinked a brow. "Oh? And what do you know about those laws?" Jedidiah shrugged. "I've heard things here and there. I know I ain't as smart as you, but I know the laws just as well as any man, and there are a few stipulations you can take advantage of, such as the maternal line priority laws." "Okay, you have my attention. So, let's say you're able to get him to agree to this. We find a solicitor, get him to contact members of your family on your mother's side. If we can demonstrate that your uncle has severed ties or neglected responsibilities to the maternal family, it weakens his claim to the inheritance. With them backing you, I reckon you'll have a much stronger case. Do you know anybody who's left on your mother's side?" "A few cousins, but nobody else," Stephen said, pondering the idea. "But what if he doesn't agree? Doesn't he need you to sign off on it? Isn't that why he's been hunting you and keeping you captive?" Jedidiah asked. "Well, in short, yes. But there are other reasons, too. Sick reasons." Jedidiah already knew. Stephen didn't have to tell him that. "Aside from that, the inheritance is what he wants. Give it to him. Then we attack." "Attack?" Stephen said, aghast. "I've been thinking about it all night. Adonijah owns a gambling den. It's where I lost most of my money and why I couldn't afford to pay my sister's medical bills. The place is a crap house. It's how I got roped into this mess. I was playing a fair game and one of Adonijah's freaking goons cheated me." Jedidiah seethed. "If I wasn't so screwed, I'd have taken the bastard out. But do you understand what I'm saying? They thrive on cheating drunks and desperate men. He used me, and when I was no longer able to deliver within his time frame, he sent Layman to kill me." "So, what do you plan to do?" "Kill him," Jedidiah replied simply. "He's the reason Isabella is dead. We find a way in, sign the inheritance over to him, and then gut the bastard." Stephen laughed, but it sounded bitter. "And that's it? Kill my uncle in cold blood and walk away with his money?" "Sounds about right." "You seem to be forgetting one small detail." Stephen sneered. "What about the police? What about his goons or the people he keeps beside him? Do you think they will let us just walk in and kill him?" "Why do you care? I thought you, out of everyone, would be on board with this," Jedidiah said, irritation sparking in his chest. "And you think I don't? I've tried to kill him every which way." "Well, keep trying. I don't freaking try. I'll kill him. There is no freaking try." Stephen's eyes narrowed into pinpricks. "And you're willing to go the distance?" "I've killed men before. More than you could count, Omega," Jedidiah said, and he picked up a stick and poked at the fire. "I've got nothing left to live for anyway." Stephen went silent at that. Jedidiah knew his mood was morbid, but he didn't care. This was personal for him. Adonijah had screwed with him for the last time. For all the years he'd been going to the gambling den, wasting his money. He'd never thought that he was actually being cheated. How many others had befallen the same trickery? How many others had lost everything? Jedidiah couldn't stomach it, and the death of his sister made things much, much worse. Jedidiah stood and limped over to the lake, trying to quell the burning in his chest. Since Layman told him Isabella was dead, he hadn't had a chance to think about it, to absorb the fact that he was alone in this world. They were all gone. Every last one of them. Jedidiah's throat constricted, and he sucked in a harsh breath, only for it to turn into a horrible sob. Damn it! He tried so hard. He dug his palms into his eyes, feeling tears well up before spilling down his cheeks. Isabella would have been 15 this year. And she was assaulted, beaten and tortured before being thrown into the freaking gutter. He had no doubt what Layman said was true. She was gone. A pair of warm hands wrapped around his waist, but Jedidiah didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. His heart fractured in his chest, and he stood there at the lake, his guts trickling out. They spilled down on the rocks like a silken ribbon, while the Omega's arms kept more from unspooling. "I don't know what you've gone through, Alpha," Stephen whispered, "but nobody in all my years has ever offered to help. Thank you." "For what?" Jedidiah rasped, trying to breathe past the pain. "For seeing my pain, too."
Chapter 5. Stephen had seen more of it than he could count, horrors that could bring even the strongest of alphas to their knees. However, he'd never seen anyone bounce back the way Jedidiah did. Stephen glanced over at him, licking his dry lips. The alpha rode beside him, clicking his tongue and chewing on straw stalk. His massive arms bunched and bulged with each movement. He gripped the reins with fierce control. He moved with a confidence that made Stephen's stomach flutter. The hot sun draped Stephen's shoulders like a regal cape as he guided his horse down the trail. They were close to Timberwood Howls now, a few miles yonder, and they'd make it back there. Back to hell! His anger flared, but it withered against his fear. It wasn't the first time he'd been taken, and he'd learned to fight with everything in him to escape. But recently the kidnappings had come much more frequently. Stephen knew his uncle would never stop hunting him. So, this time Stephen relented. There were a dozen ways he could have escaped by now, but something about Jedidiah made him want to stay. With him. Nonsense. He barely knew the wayward alpha. He was nothing like the gentle alphas with cravats and carriages he was used to in Lunarville, with their suave attitudes and forked tongues. Stephen was used to high society. There'd be no room for someone like Jedidiah in his life. And yet, something yearned inside Stephen to carve out a place for him. Stephen didn't trust easily, but knowing that he had taken Jedidiah's virginity had shifted things between them. "We can rest here for a while," a deep voice said, causing Stephen to start. Dark eyes, deep as the abyss, reflected a brooding intensity. Mounted on his horse, Jedidiah surveyed the horizon with a gaze that hinted at a connection with the untamed landscapes he traversed. Jedidiah oftentimes seemed more wolf than man, and Stephen shuddered to think that until last night he had been a virgin. Stephen's lips quirked, and he nodded, leading the horses to a small grove and sitting down beneath the shallow shades of the trees. Jedidiah wiped the sweat beneath his cowboy hat and limped to a boulder beside him. "Let me look at it," Stephen said, and took Jedidiah's boot in his hand, peeling it off before looking at his swollen ankle. It was a monstrosity, and Stephen didn't have the proper equipment here to set it properly. By his approximation, it should have healed by now. He probed at the wound gently and then turned to stare up at Jedidiah. "Why isn't it healing?" "You're asking me?" Jedidiah snorted and shook his head. Stephen frowned. Wolves' healing abilities were as easy as breathing. Jedidiah wouldn't have to exert much force to have his body mend the broken bones, unless he was exerting the force elsewhere. Stephen stood up and grabbed Jedidiah's shirt, trying to lift it up. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jedidiah sputtered. "You're hurt elsewhere. Let me have a look." Stephen spoke in a matter-of-fact tone that made most people trust him. He was a doctor, after all, a veterinarian, but animal anatomy wasn't that different from humans. That's what they supposed anyways. He pulled up Jedidiah's shirt and saw that his back was black and blue. Stephen touched the lower part of his back where his kidneys were, and Jedidiah sucked in a harsh breath. "Have you been pissing blood?" "Some. I reckoned it would pass," Jedidiah said. Stephen shook his head. They had to get to Timberwood Howls as soon as possible. "You have a bruised kidney and a few rib fractures. That's why your ankle isn't healing. We'll have to get you to the doctor as soon as possible." "I can't afford it." "You aren't paying for it," Stephen said, sitting down beside him. "Besides, I need you whole before we can carry out our plan." Jedidiah's mouth thinned into a hard line. "Then we should stay out here for the night. We can rest up before heading into town. The bastard will be on a high alert and don't want him to know we're there before we're ready." "Fair enough," Stephen replied, placing his hands behind his head. They lapsed into silence, and the cool breeze flittered through his hair and brushed against his skin. Stephen wanted to doze, but didn't think it was wise so far out in the open. But the tendrils of sleep began to weave their way around Stephen's consciousness, and he fell asleep. He dreamed he was with his mother, her soft hands carding through his hair, blunt fingernails digging into his scalp while she whispered in Danish to him. However, when Stephen looked up, her eyes turned into sucking black holes, and her lips pulled into a bloody smile before she reached down and bit a chunk out of his neck. Stephen screamed. He jumped out of her arms only to run head first into the enveloping darkness, with two red, beady eyes staring back at him. "Mine." Stephen startled awake with his heart pounding so hard it felt like it wanted to flee his ribcage. Damn it. He scrubbed a hand over his face and saw Jedidiah, still sitting on the boulder, staring down at him warily. Stephen's senses heightened. A silent presence lingered in the grove, its gaze piercing the sun rays. Adrenaline surged through him, dispelling the remnants of drowsiness. Stephen reached for the weapon by his side, ready to face the unseen threat. "Someone's here," Stephen whispered. Jedidiah nodded, his hand already on his gun. They waited for several moments, listening to the rustling of leaves. Nothing happened. Jedidiah relaxed minutely and shoved his Colt Python back in his holster. "They're gone. For now, at least." "What do you reckon it was?" Stephen asked. "An animal, I think. A large one." Jedidiah frowned. Heavy, too. He sniffed the air and recoiled as if he'd been slapped. "And rank as crap." Stephen barked a laugh. "How'd you get so good at hunting?" "Was it your father?" "Some. And some I learned by experience," Jedidiah said, kicking the dirt. "How'd you get so good at fighting?" "You weren't like a goddamn bobcat." "Yeah, well, you learn a thing or two after getting kidnapped most of your life," Stephen replied. "I don't fight with any finesse, but I can hold my own." "I'll say," Jedidiah said. Then he stood, stretching his aching limbs. "Let's head out now, Omega, before you get me into any more trouble." "I thought you liked trouble, Alpha," Stephen replied, mounting his horse. "Why else would you still be here?" "You're right. I'm messed up in the head," Jedidiah said. He struggled to get his boot back on, but once he did, he got on his horse, looking broad and muscular. Stephen's gaze tracked his open shirt and saw that it was dusted with dark hair. Unshorn black hair danced in the wind, framing Jedidiah's rugged face, and those obsidian eyes seemed to drill holes right through Stephen. His stomach knotted, and in that moment, he really hated how attractive Jedidiah was. Stephen clicked his tongue, guiding his steed back to the trail as they continued their journey. However, he couldn't stop peeking glances at Jedidiah, wondering why it had taken so long for an alpha who looked like him to lose his virginity. "What's plaguing you now, Omega? I didn't know the contours of my face were that fascinating." Stephen's face flushed. "You're completely devoid of your color. Not very fascinating to me." "And yet, you keep staring at me," Jedidiah drawled. "Or are you just deluding yourself into thinking you aren't?" "Shut up," Stephen muttered. "Does it perhaps have something to do with last night?" Stephen's blush deepened, and he turned his face away. He scoffed and tried not to breathe too deeply. The air carried Jedidiah's alpha scent of leather and baked earth. It was heady and made him feel slightly delirious as the relentless sun beat down overhead. "I'm just wondering how a man of your stature ended up being a virgin." "Are you saying that to insult my technique? Because it doesn't sound like an insult." "It wasn't. I was just curious is all, Stephen replied. Jedidiah snorted a laugh. Curious to how I could screw you like that, given that I've never screwed anyone in my life. Something like that, Stephen replied. He wouldn't acknowledge the liquid fire in his gut at the way Jedidiah said the word, damn it. Are you going to answer the question? Did you ask a question? Jedidiah's mouth kinked. You said you were wondering. I didn't hear a question in there. Your observation skills are really outstanding, Stephen muttered. It was a lead-in question, prompting you to explain more. Right. My mistake, Jedidiah said, but Stephen knew he was just teasing him. The bastard. Fine. To answer your lead-in question, I was a virgin by choice. I've never sought an Omega to sate my lust, nor do I ever plan to in the future. Why not? I don't know if you noticed, but I'm not exactly living it up in Timberwood Howls, Jedidiah said with a derisive snort. I'm in debt up to my neck. My only hope now is to get rid of Adonijah completely in order to live a normal life. Our goals just happen to align. Thank God for small mercies, Stephen muttered. Well, just so you know, freaking you was a one-time thing. My stress heat is over, so don't expect it to happen again. I wouldn't dream of it. Good. Great, Jedidiah replied, biting back a smile. I bet you've missed having someone to argue with. Of course I do. I'm a bobcat. Arguing is what we do. That and clawing people to death, Stephen said, and Jedidiah bellowed a laugh. The crackling flames danced in the darkness, casting flickering shadows across the hinterlands. Stephen leaned against a rough log, his gaze fixed on the mesmerizing flicker of flames, hissing and spitting sparks that leapt into the night sky. The warmth seeped into his bones, comforting and soothing. The scent of roasted cottontails lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the surrounding wilderness. Jedidiah joined him, nursing a bottle of rum found in one of the bags. The amber liquid burned his throat but warmed his insides as they sat lazily under the vast, star-studded sky, finding solace in the tranquil embrace of the night. Paradise? Perhaps. No rules or societal expectations. Out here, Stephen wasn't the local veterinarian, a beautiful dainty Omega whose only use was to spread his legs and breed pups. Nor was he a faceless whore freaking 10 alphas a night at Adonijah's beck and call. Adonijah's creature. They detoured close to Timberwood Howls and would have gone in, except Jedidiah wanted to stop and rest for the night nearby. It wasn't a good idea since Jedidiah's leg wasn't getting any better, not to mention the wounds on his back. Yet, all of that paled in comparison with what they needed to do. Jedidiah's alpha scent enveloped the air, a robust fusion of warm leather and sun-baked earth, grounding and masculine, like a well-worn saddle under the midday sun. Stephen was slowly becoming addicted to the smell. What? He asked, noticing Jedidiah's dopey grin. Nothing, Jedidiah said, his voice a deep rumble. You've got a look about you. Reminds me of Isabella when she fired my gun for the very first time. He chuckled. I owed some men some money, but I forgot my Colt at home. I was racing back like a bat out of hell when she met me and the other men at the door. Isabella was strong back then. Sturdy. She just gave it a lick and a promise and fired off several rounds shooting this way and that. Scared those guys crapless. They ran off with their tails between their legs, and I warned her to never fire my gun ever again, lest she wanted to accidentally kill herself. Stephen smiled. And did she listen? Hell no, Jedidiah said, sipping the rum. She went out and bought another one, her own gun. Said she needed it for protection. She sounds wonderful. She was. You would have liked her. Jedidiah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She's not as combative as you, though. Much more cordial, gentile, like all Omegas should be. How about I shove my gentle foot in your mouth, Stephen said, grabbing the rum and knocking back several large gulps. Damn, this tastes like piss. Jedidiah laughed. Yeah, leave it to freaking laymen. The bastard never did know good liquor from bathtub moonshine. Much like mistaking a thoroughbred for a mule, if you ask me. Stephen burst out laughing. Yeah, and what about you? What's your poison of choice? Whiskey. Straight. There's nothing more satisfying in this world than sipping on a glass of chilled whiskey. Really? I can think of a few better things, Stephen muttered, passing the rum back to Jedidiah. Not me. I like my whiskey like I like my men. Strong, smooth, and with a touch of southern charm. Thank God I'm the opposite, Stephen said, and Jedidiah laughed. You aren't as emotionless as you pretend to be, Omega, Jedidiah said. I see you. Stephen's breath caught and he turned to stare into those obsidian eyes. It was so hard. To be seen. Stephen knew men saw him for his looks, for what he could do for them. But very few saw him, saw the feral blood that ran through him, the rush of a good fight, the desire of being stripped bare of your senses and then thrust back into chaos. That's what Jedidiah was. Chaos. He lived his life on a knife's edge, fighting tooth and nail for his family and for a better life, only to always come up empty. Can a beast ever settle? Did he want to? Stephen sucked in a shuddering breath when Jedidiah inched closer to him, hovering. I'm not going to kiss you, Jedidiah spoke, the warmth of his breath tickling Stephen's cheek, and you're certainly not going to enjoy it. A wave of dizziness came over Stephen, and his heart began to pound. Of course not. And they tumbled into the night. Chapter 6. The horses thundered down the rugged terrain, hooves kicking up clouds of dust as Stephen and Jedidiah raced at breakneck speed. The wind howled in their ears, and the landscape blurred into a streak of earthy tones. Timberwood Howls loomed ahead, a bustling city with a vibrant market. Stephen caught Jedidiah's smirk and leaned over, sharing a bruising kiss with him before pulling away. He laughed, lurching his horse onward. Stephen was filthy. His hair was matted after days of being on the road. He stank to the high heavens of sweat and cum, and he was pretty sure he had a bruised rib, but he'd never felt more free. Tonight, he'd see Jedidiah. Look that bastard in the eye and give him exactly what he's been hunting him for all these years. It was counterintuitive, and it went against everything he felt, but Jedidiah was right. The best way to contest these things were in court. His mother's family was still alive, and he could get them to testify against his coercion. Damn, it felt good. Jedidiah's strong thighs gripped the horse's sides. Every movement resonated with power, the sinewy strength beneath the taut skin promising an indomitable force. They'd screwed all through the night, talking and drinking. It wasn't at all like those posh dates Stephen had been on, where he was barely allowed to touch the alphas. This was primal, dirty, and Stephen had relished every second of it. They wore cowboy hats and thick black bandanas over their faces to hide their appearances. The last thing they needed was Jedidiah's goons recognizing them before it was time. As they burst into the city, the scent of fresh produce and the lively chatter of the market enveloped them. Vendors haggled over prices, and the air was thick with the aroma of sizzling street food. Top hats and cravats bobbed among the crowd, a mix of city slickers and cowboys from the nearby ranches. He'd lived here most of his life, and coming back had always made him feel sick to his stomach, but now things were different. He had an alpha, a friend maybe, to watch his back. Jedidiah tried to cut him off with his horse, forcing Stephen to veer off the road for a moment. Stephen's laughter echoed through the lively streets as he steered his horse back onto the path, and they navigated the chaotic market. His heart felt lighter than ever before, the thrill of the race still coursing through his veins. They eventually reached the stables, where they dismounted and secured their horses. Cheater, Jedidiah muttered, and Stephen laughed. I'm not a cheater. You're just a crap rider, he replied, brushing the dirt off his pants. Let's have a race again and we'll see who's crap, Jedidiah responded. The stable hands greeted them, leading the steeds to comfortable stalls. The clatter of hooves was replaced by the subdued sounds of neighs and shuffling straw. They walked into a nearby inn, getting situated in one of the rooms. Stephen flopped down on the bed, sighing through his nose. He tore off his black bandana, and Jedidiah did the same. Damn, that was amazing. I almost lost my lunch, but damn, it's been ages since I've had a good ride. Most of my kidnappers just toss a potato sack over my head, and that's the end of it. Well, I'm glad I was different, but if you insist on the potato sack, that can certainly be arranged, Jedidiah said, limping to the bed. He took of his boot and hissed. Stephen sat up, examining the wound. It went down a bit, I think, but my back still hurts like a mother bastard. Screwing in the dirt probably didn't help, Stephen replied and then sighed. Okay, let's call the doctor and then... No, Jedidiah said quickly, then cleared his throat. I need to find Isabella first. At least let me have that, and then we can see about a doctor. Just stay here. Don't go anywhere you don't need to go and lay low. We can figure out how to see Jedidiah together, okay? You want to split up? For now. I'll be back before dark. I promise, Jedidiah said. I have to see her first. I need to know. Why don't you let me come with you? No, please, just stay here. I'll be back, I promise, Jedidiah said, more forcefully this time, and Stephen nodded. It was better that he didn't go walking around. Jedidiah put his black hat back on, along with his bandana, boots, and then pressed a soft kiss to his temple. I'll be back. Don't cause any trouble before I do. Stephen melted into the kiss, realizing it was becoming more and more natural between them to touch and kiss each other. Jedidiah pulled away, and Stephen heard the door click shut. Stephen dozed on the bed, the midday sun casting a warm glow through the window. The rhythmic sounds of the city outside seemed to lull him into a drowsy stupor. As he teetered on the edge of consciousness, a light knock on the door jolted him awake. Blinking away the haze, Stephen stumbled to the door, feeling an odd sense of disorientation. He opened it to find a strange man standing in the hallway, his gaze fixed on Stephen. Before he could utter a word, someone else came up behind him, and a sudden blunt impact to the back of his head sent the world spinning. Darkness enveloped Stephen as he crumpled to the floor, the slam of the door echoing behind him. The room plunged into an abyss, and the muffled sounds of the city outside faded into an eerie silence. Stephen woke with a start, his heart slamming against his ribcage as an acrid stench of death and decay filled his nostrils. A headache threatened to split his skull from the impact, and he swallowed down the bile surging in his throat. Where am I? He looked around and saw he was in an underground basement. The windows were blackened with silk, rendering everything in darkness. He could discern nothing but the sliver of light coming from beneath the basement door, situated at the top of a long wooden staircase. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped in this ominous place. Stephen turned and jumped when he saw a woman nailed to the chair right beside him. Her face was caved in with a baseball bat, her mouth a swirling red pit of blood and bone. Stephen almost gagged and tore his gaze away, trying not to breathe too deeply. Finally, the door opened, and Stephen was blinded by the intense light. The clicking of cowboy boots against the wooden stairs caused all the hair to rise at the back of his neck. Then, golden spurs glittered in the light, and in walked Adonijah. He didn't look like how Stephen remembered him. His face was gaunt, with sunken cheeks and a chalky complexion. His eyes were red, and he was foaming at the mouth like a deranged beast. His lithe body hunched over as if he were a rabid dog. Stephen started to struggle, fighting hard against the restraints to try to escape, but they wouldn't budge. Adonijah laughed, but it sounded sick, a gurgling noise in the back of his throat like he was drowning. The air thickened with fear as Stephen realized the man was completely unhinged. "Stephen, you finally made it," Adonijah said. "Good. Now we can officially begin." The lights flicked on, and he saw Jedidiah strung up in the far corner. It had been too dark to see him before, but now that he could, his heart jammed into his throat. Chained with his hands pinned to a pillar above his head, Jedidiah's torso was covered in large welts. Blood streamed down the side of his face as he swayed uneasily. How did this happen? Jedidiah had gone off to find his sister. To find his... Stephen's heart stopped. He turned slowly to the women next to him. She was frail, very thin, and looked to be about the age that Layman described. And she had been tortured and killed. For what? Rage flared through him like a comet shredding through the sky. You killed her? Why? Why the freaking hell did you kill her? Stephen screamed. In all the years they've been playing this game, Adonijah never once stepped over the line like this. He never once killed so recklessly. For you, everything for you. Can't you see that? Can't you see what you are to me? My creature, my property. You shouldn't have run, Stephen. A dog should come when his master calls. You want my mother's freaking money, then take it. Take all of it, you sick bastard, and leave me the hell alone. Stephen screamed his throat raw. I'm so glad we could come to an agreement, Stephen. He smiled and brought over a large piece of paper. Sign here, please, and don't delay. I'm afraid your friend won't last long. Stephen signed it. Even with his hand freaking bound, he signed it. He didn't give a crap anymore. It wasn't worth the cost. Adonijah grinned, rolling the paper up in his bony hands and passing it to one of his goons. Now, time to discuss the method of repayment. Since you killed 2 of my men, you must compensate me, Stephen. Do you remember how? Of course you do. You've been doing it since you were a boy. The men were lining up. In total, there were 5, and then Adonijah would be the last. It was the way they did things. For many years, Stephen had been resigned to it. Fear kept him rooted to the spot. It was just like Layman. When he knew it was coming, he could do nothing but freeze, ice filling his veins. Adonijah laughed and inched forward, then stroked his cheek. Just like your mother. Don't worry. Once they're done, we can find a nice, comfy ditch for you. Wouldn't that be nice? Not your dog, a voice rasped, and Stephen's head snapped to the side of the room. Jedidiah's head hung low, blood trickling down his brow. What did you say? Adonijah demanded. He's not your freaking dog. He's a goddamn bobcat, and don't you freaking forget it. Each word chilled Stephen to the bone. With immense force, Jedidiah yanked his chains down, tearing right through the solid wooden beam. It splintered and then shattered. A nearby pipe burst, dousing the oil lamps with rushing water and plunging the room into darkness. People started shouting and moving, while Stephen fought with everything in him against the chains. Suddenly he was tackled to the floor, thrown face first into the body of water. His lungs screamed for air, and he kicked his legs out violently, but whoever was on top of him wouldn't budge. Then, a horrible ripping sound pierced his ears, and he was pulled back to the surface. Jedidiah stood above him, covered in blood. He slammed his hammer against the chains, and they burst wide open. Stephen could barely breathe past his shock. Jedidiah's eyes locked onto Adonijah, who was scrambling up the stairs, but Jedidiah snarled, his mouth curling over his jagged teeth, and he shifted into a massive brown wolf. Everything happened so fast. Adonijah shifted, but not into a wolf. Something much worse. His skin clung to bone, long horns adorned his scalp, and he spun around to attack Jedidiah, puncturing him with his horns and piercing his ribcage. Jedidiah reeled back but pressed forward. They brawled, crashing into wooden beams and brick walls caving in around them. A man tried to grab Stephen, but he shifted into his wolf form, bursting out and helping Jedidiah kill the man. Lunging for Adonijah's jugular, Stephen was swift, but the man sliced his claws down Stephen's flank. Stephen jerked back with a howl, then jumped right back in. He wouldn't let him win. Fury exploded inside his core, and the second Jedidiah jumped on his back, Stephen flew to his throat and tore it out clean. Adonijah dropped like a stone in the basement, which was quickly flooding with water. They had to go. Jedidiah swayed dangerously on his feet, but Stephen kept him standing. Come on, he said through the link, and Jedidiah nodded in dazed understanding. They sprinted out the front door together, and Stephen knocked over several oil lamps near the door, setting the place ablaze. They made it outside, watching as the old Victorian mansion, once pure white, was engulfed by the torrential columns of flames. Jedidiah shifted back from wolf form, his chest heaving and his ankle twisted at a strange angle. Stephen shifted back too. People ran around them, shouting, trying to douse the flames, but all they could do was stand and watch. Isabella was gone, and now they were both left alone in the world. Stephen's chest ached for Jedidiah, but something told him that the Alpha had already made peace with it. Either way, none of that mattered. Stephen would look after him. From now on, Jedidiah wouldn't struggle in this world. Stephen would see to that. From the day they met, Stephen knew this man was special. He was the only one who saw him and swore to help him, regardless of the outcome. Stephen would never forget it. Jedidiah's chest heaved, his face covered in blood and sweat. There were no words left to be spoken. It was finished now. Stephen's hand slipped into Jedidiah's, and they stood together, watching the house burn. 6 months later, the clinic smelled like hay, antiseptic, and success. Dr. Holloway was finishing up with a client, a rancher from the next county whose prized mare had just delivered a healthy calf. The man was all smiles, gripping the vet's hand like he performed the miracle himself. "Doc, you've got magic hands," the rancher said, tipping his hat. "Word's gotten out. You're going to be booked solid till next spring." "Wouldn't be the worst problem to have," Holloway replied with a chuckle, walking him out past the front porch, where 3 more pickups waited in the dusty gravel. Business was booming. People traveled from far and wide now, drawn by the clinic's quiet care and growing reputation. He still didn't love the spotlight, but it felt good. honest, to be seen, to be trusted. Once the client pulled away, Holloway made his way to the back pasture, the sun warming his shoulders. The fence posts gleamed from the fresh paint they'd applied last month, and wildflowers nodded in the breeze along the paddock's edge. A white stallion paced near the fence, proud and curious. Jedidiah stood leaning against the rail, one hand resting gently on the stallion's mane like he was born to touch things wild and untamed. His jeans were worn, dusty at the knees, and his open flannel revealed a white tank that clung to sun-kissed skin. As he felt the approach behind him, he turned, wind tugging at his soft black curls, tossing them around his face. "You good?" Holloway called out, grinning like a fool. Jed glanced at the stallion, then back at him, a wide, easy smile spreading across his face. "I'm golden." They had buried his sister beneath a willow tree not long after the move, said their goodbyes to Timberwood Howls and all its lingering ghosts. This place, their place, wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, it was healing, and it was theirs. The wind rustled the leaves as Jed reached for Holloway's hand, grounding him like he always did. Yeah, they were golden. The end.